So I'd like to start by getting a quick show of hands amongst all of you in the audience. How many of you guys have seen the recent Seth Rogen film, The Interview? And now, of those of you who have seen it, how many of you guys think it's a somewhat reasonably accurate portrayal of a visit to North Korea and touring the country? The central theme of what I'm talking about is actually very present in The Interview, and that is this concept of honeypotting. For those of you that haven't seen the film, honeypotting refers to deliberately appealing to less rational aspects of a person in order to seduce them into believing something or advancing a personal agenda. In the movie, this is what Kim Jong-un does to James Franco's character by convincing him that North Korea isn't as bad as the Western media says it is by using a fake grocery store, fake fruits, and a fake fat kid. Now, in my experience, this is a very possible phenomenon, especially when it comes to North Korea. And it is one that highlights the nature of conflicting perceptions, particularly in a dynamic and pluralistic world that involves multiple countries, as in this situation. But I'm not here to talk about what I think will be a Franco-Rogan cult classic. I'm here to talk about an actual experience to North Korea and what it's like to visit the country, a real exposition about the challenges of internationalism. So 2 years ago, I found out about an opportunity offered as part of a school trip to visit North Korea and tour the country. Like most of my friends at the time, I thought it was a joke, and I think some context is important to understand why. So this was a time where North Korea was always making headlines for things like threatening to turn South Korea into a sea of fire, threatening the mainland United States, and just generally their usual dictatorial shenanigans. They were more present, or at least being louder about what they were doing. So naturally, I jumped at this perfect opportunity to visit the country at this time. So March 2013 rolls around, and with it comes our departure to Pyongyang. Now the question that many of you have, and I'm sure and I had at that time, was how do you get to North Korea? Because as far as I understood, you can't fly there directly from Hong Kong. So how we got there, as is the case for most tourists, is we fly to Beijing first, stay a night in Beijing, and the next day we board a Soviet-era refurnished plane, a very small aircraft, and fly to Pyongyang, North Korea's capital. Now, making up the other half of the passengers on the plane was what we understood to be a North Korean national youth soccer team. Now, one of my friends had FIFA loaded up on his iPad, and we were going to pass the time by playing that on the plane. And through slow, exaggerated, kind of universal sign language gestures, we managed to kind of communicate with the national soccer team enough to get through a game of FIFA on the iPad. I wasn't aware of it then, but in retrospect, this would be my first experience in connecting with the other and stepping into this enigmatic challenge to worldviews. I want to talk about the ground rules for visiting North Korea for a second. There are two golden rules, as repeatedly stressed by our tour guides upon arrival. The first one is you're not allowed to go anywhere without your tour guide. So you're allowed to walk around your hotel room and within your floor in your hotel, but you're not allowed to leave that building without being accompanied by at least one of the two state-mandated tour guides. And two, you're only allowed to take photos when your tour guides allow you to. And usually this would be of monuments, such as those depicted here, and also of things that basically portray the country in a very positive light. It's important to know these rules because they are important and in forming the framework upon which a tourist's perception of North Korea is crafted. So what I mean is that assuming that these rules are followed to the letter, a tourist will come away from the trip with exactly the impression that a North Korean government would want them to have. And that impression will be spread to his or her family and friends through their photos and through talking about the trip, and so spreading the perception of North Korea that is desirable to their government. And it's in this context that we can examine the impressions, especially first impressions that the visit gave me and gave many of my peers. So first impressions? Well, to us, upon arrival, Pyongyang seemed clean, well-organized, and generally appeared to be a functioning, somewhat grand capital of a decently governed country. When I watched The Interview, I was struck by the scene where James Franco's character reacted to his first impressions of North Korea. He thought that the country was nothing like how it was portrayed usually, and he suspected exaggeration by Western media. This is because this is what many members of my trip thought, and I'll admit to thinking that too upon arrival because of the sites and the monuments that we were shown of Pyongyang. Different but functional. That's what my first impressions amounted to. Different because of the Goliath-sized monuments to Kim Il-sungism, which is the country's governing philosophy, a modified brand of communism, and also different because, and also monuments to their leaders. But also functional because despite this kind of governing ideology that seems so foreign to someone with democratic ideals like you or me, we didn't see anything in our first few days there that would really make us question its effectiveness or its results. And so, the one exception to that was the prevalence of propaganda posters everywhere throughout the capital. And that's something that I think really highlights a disconnect between how the ideals that we hold, such as freedom of expression, versus the ideals that were portrayed upon our first impressions in North Korea. And so now we come to a conflict. How do we reconcile what we're being shown on our tour with our preconceived notions of North Korea? And how do we equate our experience with our guides with what the outside world knows about North Korea through their research and through interactions? It's these questions that make us more critical of our experience and more attuned to the inconsistencies of the tour. I mentioned earlier that the ground rules of North Korea formed a framework in which one can examine their own impressions of the country. But the reality is that we can't view this country within this isolated framework. And it's when we realize that we fully grasp the value of an outsider's visit to North Korea. And that's to compare our experience with how we perceived North Korea before, and in doing so, highlighting the many inconsistencies that, for me, in my perspective, reaffirmed my convictions about the country, its many problems, and its many human rights abuses. So let's take a look at these inconsistencies. For one thing, our first impressions, our positive first impressions, only lasted as long as we were in Pyongyang. Once we left the capital, the images of rural areas, as shown here, were much more aligned with our preconceptions of what a state in poverty with an oppressive government would look like. It's interesting to note that many of these contrasting images of rural areas that we saw were only shown on bus rides as we drove from one tour point to another. And I think that speaks mountains about the framework in which we're expected to view North Korea by our guides, which is only the destinations that they bring us to. Now, on bus rides, you're not actually allowed to take photos, if you remember the second rule that I spoke about earlier. And so with that, this underscores that these negative portrayals of North Korea are not part of the framework that we are intended to perceive the country in. Our tour experience itself contrasted with what we knew about North Korea as well. So every meal prearranged as part of the tour was plentiful and filling, and exactly what you expect someone to provide for tourists. This became another part of the tour that disoriented all our perceptions, because how do we reconcile that with all the historical and reported famines that the country and the country's people have faced? And so this is another part of the tour that really disoriented our perceptions, and in retrospect, I view as a honeypotting of our visit to North Korea. Closer to the end of the tour, we had a visit to the Sinchon Museum of American War Atrocities. This entire museum was dedicated to the alleged atrocities committed by American soldiers during the Korean War. Now, it's interesting to note that in this museum, there were lots of photos of every other scenario in the war, including battles, injured soldiers, raids, etc. But the up-close depictions of alleged atrocities were only depicted through paintings, through artists' interpretations, which, as you can see here, may or may not be exaggerated. And so with this kind of inconsistency in the way that these atrocities were depicted, there is another inconsistency with how we perceive North Korea and the narrative that we were being presented within the country. And it became up to us to discern what we chose to believe. And these conflicts highlight the value in critically examining the dissonance that arises when one's perceptions don't line up perfectly with the reported realities of a country. In our case, we had North Korea presented to us in a way that did not match did not match what we knew about the country through its human rights abuses, and as such highlighting the importance of being able to discern these inconsistencies. But certain perceptions were indeed inaccurate and distorted. We hear so often about the politics of North Korea and the actions and personhood of its leaders that we often forget about the people themselves and they become an afterthought. One of the last parts of our tour involved going to a local school with what I presume to be genuine students, and we had some unstructured time to interact with them as we chose. We chose to spend this time playing football with them. Despite dividing the teams up as us against them, it was quickly becoming clear that in spending time with the students, that this us against them mentality that was so common when we view North Korea as a country was clouding our perception of its people by tangentially antagonizing them as well. As such, the distinction between people and politics is perhaps the single perception that did, in fact, alter my impression of North Korea successfully throughout the visit. I'd like to leave you with a few questions that arose during my trip. These are questions that were brought up, but still unanswered, and as I speak to you today, I still have yet to answer these questions in the context of North Korea. How do we critically examine our perception of the unknown when they conflict with what we know? And more importantly, and more relevant to this context, how do we apply these evolving perceptions to a world of internationalism? Thank you.